BibleWorm, BibleWorm, reading the Bible, BibleWorm. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of BibleWorm, getting to the core of the biblical text. I'm Dr. Robert Williamson, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Hendrix College and pastor of Mercy Community Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm joined this and every week by my friend and colleague, Dr. Amy Robertson, biblical scholar and executive director at Congregation Beit Haverim in Atlanta. This week we continue our Narrative Lectionary Series with Mark 7, 1 through 23, in which Jesus argues with the Pharisees over proper ritual observance. We talk about what it means that nothing from outside us can make us unclean, how to disagree constructively with people who have different sources of authority, and how the only thing that really matters is what we put out into the world. Also, Amy interrogates my hand-washing practices. Thanks for joining us. Hey Amy, how are you this week?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I am doing great. I am really jazzed about talking about some disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees over legal matters.
Mark 7.
Mark 7.
I love a good legal fight.
Yeah. Here we go. Chapter 7, verse 1. The Pharisees and some legal experts from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus. They saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean hands. And then in parentheses in the CEB, they were eating without first ritually purifying their hands through washing. The Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat without first washing their hands carefully. This is a way of observing the rules handed down by the elders. Upon returning from the marketplace, they don't eat without first immersing themselves. They observe many other rules that have been handed down, such as the washing of cups, jugs, pans, and sleeping mats. End parentheses. So the Pharisees and legal experts asked Jesus, "Why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down by the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands?" The Pharisees and the legal experts are upset because Jesus' disciples are eating without ritually purifying themselves, washing their hands in a ritual way before they eat. Mm-hmm. And then Mark goes on to explain that
they wash all kinds of things.
They wash
you wouldn't
all
believe
the
what
things.
The Jews wash.
Yeah, they wash so many things. And explicitly in verse 3, the Pharisees and all the Jews do these things.
Right.
So,
which first we should say, it's not all the Jews who do these things. Right. Yeah. There are different groups of Jews at this time. But yes, there's washing things is an important part of Jewish ritual then and now.
Now that's true, but it seems to me like the Pharisees have kind of upped the ante or raised the bar here over what's really kind of prescribed in the actual written words of the Torah. Is that right?
I think that is right. So at least the way that modern Judaism would see this is Jewish law, Jewish teaching has two parts. There's what's written in the Torah, the written Torah, and then there is a sort of accompanying tradition that tradition says was given at the same time to Moses at Sinai.
Right.
Right? And that's referred to as the oral Torah. So there are all these sort of teachings that accompany the material that's in the written Torah that sort of tell you what you're supposed to do about that. And so these teachings about washing are all in the oral Torah. They're not in, if you were to look them up in the Hebrew Bible, you're not going to find them.
So one way of understanding what the Pharisees have done here is, and I mean the Pharisees are known for this, is they have extended the rules that are explicitly in the Torah for priests in the temple, and they have said this applies to all Jews in the Holy Land, or maybe all Jews everywhere. They're kind of taking this idea that Israel is a priestly community and the Holy Land is a holy place, and therefore all Jews in all their homes, all their land ought to follow the prescriptions for priests in the temple. At least that's my understanding of what's happening here. Does that sound right to you?
I mean, I think it does sound right. The way that it was explained to me was sort of as we're sort of entering this time period where worshiping God through the temple cult is going down, right? Like that's not the only way that people are engaging. And in some ways, maybe it's not even the primary way that people are engaging. As that ritual practice is decreasing in its importance, the role especially of the table at home. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot more sort of sanctification of eating.
Yeah.
And, we remember that the sacrifices they did at the temple were related to eating. Like it was a way of feeding God. I mean, it's not like there was a literal belief that God was eating, but that was the sort of sense of it. And you could share a meal with God by burning part of the sacrifice and then cooking the rest of it for others to be able to eat. And so as this all sort of moved to the table in your home, practices like washing your hands, washing your food, in a certain way sort of also traveled over.
So in verse 5, the Pharisees and legal experts say to Jesus, "Why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down by the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands?" So that phrase, rules handed down by the elders, is referencing what you were just talking about as the oral Torah.
That's how I understand it.
I think that's right. So it's not that Jesus and his disciples are violating the written Torah of Moses.
Correct.
But that they are not observing the traditions of the Pharisees, which they understand to have also been handed down at Sinai and passed along orally.
Right. So they understand them to be binding.
Yeah.
Of all of the bizarro rituals that they could choose to talk about in this text, I am so glad they chose hand washing and washing your food.
Yeah.
And so while there are a lot of ancient rituals that might sound weird to us, and we'll wonder why on earth someone would think it was important to do that, we might think it was like delightfully provincial or frustratingly bizarre. This is washing hands. Like we can get behind washing hands as modern Western people, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I want to ask you a question, Bobby.
Okay. Yeah.
Why do you wash your hands before eating? You yourself.
I don't, because Jesus says in just a minute, like, don't worry about it. So I haven't washed my hands since 1984.
That's beautiful.
I'm just kidding.
Okay.
I wash my hands. I wash my hands because I think dirty hands are a disease vector, and I would like to not have diseases.
You would like to not have diseases. Excellent. And we have, over the course of this podcast, identified many things that we are not. We are Bible scholars, but we are not IT professionals. We are not
podcast
home
mavens.
Improvement gurus.
Oh, yeah.
We are not podcast we've come up with many things we're not. I will add to that list, I am also not personally a scientist.
Yeah.
So I wash my hands because I believe the authority structures who have told me that you ought to wash your hands because it keeps your community alive. It minimizes the spread of disease and bacteria. You don't want to eat pesticides, whatever, right? But it's not like I personally know that. Like I haven't discovered that truth myself. I just believe in authority who told me that I need to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's what I will say sort of from a ritual perspective about this. Like it's very easy for us to think about something being a ritual and like, so now it doesn't make sense. But ritual is all about like believing in the systems that are at play in your society and the authorities that you've grown up with.
Yeah.
So I guess I want us to try on the idea that like we're not so different from these Pharisees who say like, why, it's like, it makes me picture like the look that a parent would get if their 10-year-old came out of the bathroom and didn't wash their hands. Like you would look at that parent and say like, why didn't your child wash their hands? Like it is harmful to our society if people don't wash their hands, and you should make them do that because it's your child or it's your disciple. Yeah. Does that make any sense to you?
It absolutely makes sense. That, like, of course, this is something that you ought to do, and the fact that you're not doing it is kind of horrifying from the perspective of the Pharisees. In the same way that, like, like me with my kid, like trying to make sure that she does the things that are necessary for her to be healthy. I just do want to clarify that the issue here is not that the disciples never wash their hands, right? This is about ritual hand washing.
Right.
So in the way that we think one ought to wash one's hand for health reasons, biological health reasons, the Pharisees are kind of saying you ought to wash your hands for like religious health reasons.
Right. Yeah. For like spiritual health. And it is a spiritual health that can impact not only you, the hand washer or non-hand washer, but sort of the relationship of our community to God. Like the spiritual health of our community is impacted when people choose not to follow the rituals.
That's very helpful, yeah. One thing that's also, I think, probably worth saying is that in Mark's little aside to the reader, he says the Pharisees and all Jews don't eat without first washing their hands carefully. And in the first century context, anyway, that wasn't actually true.
Mm-hmm.
There was an internal Jewish dispute about the role of ritual hand washing. So the Sadducees, for instance, were not ritual hand washers outside of the kind of temple area. It was something that the Pharisees valued. They valued it, and they thought all Jews should, but not all Jews did.
Yes, absolutely.
So Jesus and his disciples they're kind of taking a position within an internal Jewish dispute. This is not Jesus versus the Jews. This is Jesus who is a
the
Jew
versus
taking
the other Jews.
versus some of the other, one sect of the other Jews. Yeah. So the Pharisees have now accused Jesus of not living according to the oral Torah, the rules handed down by the elders. Jesus replies in verse 6, Isaiah really knew what he was talking about when he prophesied about you hypocrites. He wrote, This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. Their worship of me is empty, since they teach instructions that are human words. You ignore God's commandment while holding on to rules created by humans and handed down to you.
Yeah, so basically, God didn't say that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Jesus has said the oral Torah is not God's word. It is things that you made up. And he's going back to saying what is written in the law of Moses, that is in the 5 books of the Torah, that is God's word.
Right.
And what you say is not. Yeah.
So the question is, which practices are authoritative and authentic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And Jesus disagreed. Jesus, as a Jew, disagrees with the Pharisees as Jews about what the answer to that question is.
Yeah, I mean, so Jesus quotes Isaiah here. I mean, and the essence of this quotation from Isaiah is the people are going through the motions of being religious. They're doing things that they have kind of made up as human people that actually don't get to the core of what worshiping God is really about. Isaiah has said that about some of the Israelites in the 8th century. Jesus is now saying, that thing that Isaiah said back then, it now applies to you, scribes and Pharisees.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So I'm just curious, if you tried to put yourself in the position of the Pharisees in this text, and Jesus says this about you, how would you imagine they might respond?
I mean, I think it's a frustrating argument to try to have, because if at the end of the day they don't agree on, here are the ground rules for figuring out Jewish practice, right?
Yeah.
It's like the Pharisees and Jesus and the Sadducees and, different groups of Jews are working with different ground rules. And so you can't really have a fruitful conversation about that. I mean, Jesus's argument back to them isn't trying to explain to them, doesn't engage the specific issue of the authority or a lack of authority in the oral tradition that's been handed down, or why the Pharisees think that that's authoritative and why Jesus doesn't think it's authoritative. He just says, God didn't say that.
Yeah.
So that to me is just they have such different starting points that I don't know how to make that a real dialogue.
I think that's right. I mean, Jesus has said, basically he said the oral Torah is just human words. God doesn't have anything to do with that. And the Pharisees' response would be no, these were handed down to us on Sinai. This is exactly God's word.
I mean, we hear the same conversation sometimes still about the written scripture, right? There are communities who say, this is God's word. You can't engage it in the way that you're engaging it. You can't question it. You can't reinterpret it. It was written exactly, by God's hand. And then there are other people who are no, it wasn't.
Yeah.
And it's hard to move past that in a conversation.
Yeah. And they are all believers who consider themselves to be
earnestly
religious.
And wholeheartedly believe that this is the best way to bring God into the world is through their set of beliefs, but they just had different starting places.
Yeah. In verse 9, Jesus continued, clearly you are experts at... Jesus is so snarky, man.
Jesus is,
Jesus continued, clearly you are experts at rejecting God's commandment in order to establish these rules. Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and the person who speaks against father or mother will certainly be put to death. But you say, If you tell your father or mother, everything I'm expected to contribute to you is korban, that is, a gift I'm giving to God, then you are no longer required to care for your father or mother. In this way, you do away with God's word in favor of the rules handed down to you, which you pass on to others, and you do a lot of other things just like that. Jesus, just going for it.
Okay, I just have to say that the fact that Jesus uses this example made me laugh a little bit, because didn't we have like a couple chapters earlier where God was like, my mother, I don't want to see my mother.
Yeah,
like,
who are my mother and brother
here
and
are my
sisters?
brother and my sister. I don't need to talk to you.
Yeah.
Which I found, which was hard for me to be like, your mother. Like,
yeah, right on. Yeah,
because of honor your mother and your father. So now Jesus throw this in their face.
Yeah.
Man.
Yes, and we'll see in just a minute. Yeah, Jesus is sort of like, he's going to go on in just a second to kind of disregard another very clear command in the Torah. And so, like, Jesus, there's a dispute here about the authority of Jesus versus the authority of the Pharisees versus the authority of the scriptures themselves. This whole, it would be really easy to not have any idea what's even at dispute here in this thing about honor your father and mother, but the korban I'm giving to God. Like, can you help untangle, what is the argument here? Or what are people doing that Jesus is objecting to?
This, to me, reads in a lot of ways, like a true-to-life situation now, where you have commitments to different things that you take seriously.
Mm-hmm.
You take seriously your commitment to your parents. You take seriously your commitment to your children. You take seriously your commitment to your religious community or your spiritual community or other charities that are sort of wrapped up in your sense of godliness in the world. And you make commitments to different ones. And sometimes it's really difficult to balance them out. Like, sometimes they're in conflict with each other, or your resources are limited and you can't do as much as you want for all of your different beloved people or causes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what I read in here is just like, if you commit to giving a gift to God,
yeah,
I mean, food or money or something like that, then you can't give it to your parents. To which I'm sort of like, well, duh. Like, yeah, but does that mean you shouldn't give anything to anyone but your parents? I don't know. It just seems like a very not nuanced, or like not recognizing the complexity of human relationship kind of argument. Do you see more nuance? I mean, there's got to be more in there than that.
I mean, I think you're kind of right about that. So on the one hand, you've got honor your father and mother, which doesn't just mean like say nice things about them. It means like support them in their old age when they need money and shelter and these kinds of things. And on the other hand is the korban, or the gift to give to God. And both of these are values. Like, I think, if you're trying to translate it into like Christian practice today, you would think like taking care of your parents versus tithing to the church.
Right.
And if you can't afford to do both of these things, then which one takes precedence? Mm-hmm. And Jesus is accusing the Pharisees of giving their tithe first and letting the parents kind of go unattended. Mm-hmm. And Jesus seems to be saying, like, of course that's not what you ought to do. He seems to be attributing nefarious intent to them a little bit. Mm-hmm. Like, they're using this, I'm giving this to God as an offering, as an excuse to not care for your father and mother. Like, I don't want to do it.
Which would certainly be problematic.
Yeah, but I imagine if you asked a Pharisee, they would say that's not what we're doing at all. Like, we're trying to honor God and take care of our parents, but we don't have enough resources to do both.
Right. So we're doing the dance that we all do.
Yeah.
Right? To try to be fair to all of the different things we've committed to.
Yeah, exactly right. It's worth saying, too, that in the Mishnah, there's an argument about this exact question, which takes priority, the korban or the honoring of father and mother. And the Mishnah decides, actually, the Mishnah agrees with Jesus that if you can't do both, you should take care of your parents first. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting here. It's like, it's depicted as like Jesus versus the Jews or Jesus versus the Pharisees. But in fact, Jewish tradition itself comes down on the same side.
Comes down in line,
on the same side as Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So in verse 14, Jesus called the crowd again and said, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. Nothing outside of a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, the things that come out of a person contaminate the person." Now, Jesus is going to go on in the next little section and explain what he meant by that to his disciples, but he doesn't explain what he means by it to the crowd. What do you make of Jesus's aside to the crowd here?
It does give a sense of, like, safety in a way. You know, that, like, there's nothing... I sort of get a sense of, like, nothing can hurt you. Nothing can hurt your purity status. Nothing can, like, infiltrate from the outside. Like, I picture us in this, like, sort of little sacred bubble that, like, nothing can get in and sort of cause harm in that way.
Yeah.
But then the second part, the things that come out are what defile. That has different, like, imagery with it.
No, I really like that of the, like, it's, you know, you're kind of in control here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't have to be responsible for the external factors that are coming at you. What you're responsible for is controlling what emerges from you, like what you say and what you do. Yeah. And so you just, in that sense, like you just got to be responsible for yourself. Like, you can't always help what situation you're in. You don't have to worry so much about all the, like, details of all the things. Just, like, pay attention to what you're putting into the world. I really kind of like that statement.
Yeah. No, I do too.
Verse 17, after leaving the crowd, he entered a house where his disciples asked him about that riddle. He said to them, "Don't you understand either? Don't you know that nothing from the outside that enters a person has the power to contaminate? That's because it doesn't enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and it goes out into the sewer." By saying this, Jesus declared that no food could contaminate a person in God's sight. It's what comes out of a person that contaminates someone in God's sight, he said. It's from the inside, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual sins, thefts, murders, adultery, greed, evil actions, deceit, unrestrained immorality, envy, insults, arrogance, and foolishness. All these evil things come from the inside and contaminate a person in God's sight. So much happened in those little 6 verses. So many things.
Yes, indeed.
One could certainly understand Jesus here as absolutely getting rid of kosher law binding on Christians, and maybe the whole purity codes altogether. Like, there is nothing outside of you that can contaminate you in God's sight. Could be read as, like, so, I mean, Leviticus, don't worry about it so much.
Right, which is really interesting because this whole sort of section started with basically an argument about the validity of the oral tradition.
Yeah.
Right? Not the written tradition. It did not start by saying, like, why didn't Jesus just start out by saying, oh, actually, all those food laws are not, all that purity stuff is not actually valid. It started out by saying the oral tradition is not valid, and now all of a sudden it's gone to, it actually doesn't matter what food you eat.
So Jesus has done exactly what he's accused. It was not even, like, because the Pharisees were not saying don't follow the law.
They weren't overturning it. They were just...
They were amplifying it.
Yeah.
Here's what's written, so do that and more. Jesus then says, stop saying that, just do what's in the Torah. And now he's saying, yeah, don't do stuff that's in the Torah when it relates to ritual purity. I mean, so Jesus is now claiming the authority for his own interpretation, which he has denied the Pharisees' tradition. That tradition doesn't have authority, but mine does.
Right.
So he's acknowledging,
which makes sense in the context. I mean, that's what a lot of the conversation between the Pharisees and Jesus have been, right?
Yeah.
This sort of battle of who has the authority.
Yeah. Then Jesus goes on and lists, like, I love this list of things
it really spans a lot of ground.
It does. So the first thing is, so sexual sins, theft, murder, adultery, greed, evil action, deceit, unrestrained immorality. But then it kind of takes a shift to, like, by the end, it's like insult, arrogance, foolishness. Like, I started out reading this list, like, okay, like, I can manage to not do most of these things.
I can manage not to murder someone.
Yeah, like, I've lived this long without murdering anyone. But
I have certainly had some moments of folly.
Yeah, like, I mean, we've had like 4 in this podcast. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it's like what emerges from your heart. That's what matters. And the bar, in my reading anyway, that Jesus is setting ends up being a pretty high bar. What are your thoughts about all of that?
Like in the beginning, I'm sort of like, oh, great, this is much better than kosher laws. Like,
Yeah.
Just don't do these things. Okay, fine. But then like, don't feel envy. Don't feel pride. Like, what do you do if you feel those things in your heart? Like, how do you deal with your defiled self?
Yeah.
Without sort of access to this ritual system that was sort of set up to deal with ritual purity. So, like what is the system to deal with that? And maybe that's the question. Like, how do we deal with these legitimately? I mean, like, I don't know about the word defile, whatever, but like those are things that will eat at you.
Yeah.
And so you need to deal with them somehow. But I haven't yet found a way to just like wash them from my consciousness.
What I kind of think is that, this passage is acknowledging that the things that are in our heart eventually come out. Like, if you have hatred in your heart or greed in your heart or foolishness in your heart, it's going to come out some way or another. So the goal ought to be to figure out how to eliminate those things.
And deal with it, yeah.
In the big picture, your question about how do you like set yourself right if you have experienced anger, for most Christian theology, and this is not in this Mark passage, but for most Christian theology, there's only so much you can do, right? You're going to be contaminated. And so in some way or another, the death and resurrection of Jesus has made that right with God. We're justified with God through Jesus. And the details of how that works are many and variable.
Complex. We won't go into that right now.
But the near-term question about like, okay, well, that's all well and good. But like, how do I live tomorrow when I have been angry today or I have been greedy today? That's less clear. Like, how do we set ourselves right, like now? So we've started moving a little bit toward our closing question about like, what does this mean for us?
Well, I have two thoughts about how I think this text sort of would live within me and within my Jewish community, at least to start with. One of them is based on this really resonant quote from Jesus: "There's nothing outside a person that by going in can defile."
Yeah.
And the first thing it made me think of, once we move beyond the realm of like food, is the types of traumatic experiences that people endure that change the way that they think about themselves. Like because something bad happened to you, that, people carry a sense of either survivors of sexual assault or, I don't know, there are a lot of different things that can happen to you where some sort of evil power system takes advantage of you, and you somehow internalize that as a shame that you carry.
Yeah.
And so it's just really like, I don't know, that's the sort of resonance of that text for me, is to sort of speak to people who feel like their sense of self has been sullied or negatively shaped by things that came into them from the outside.
Yeah. That's really beautiful and important.
The other thing that comes to mind is just, as you were talking before about like, who's your authority? Like when we're getting into dialogues with, cross-community dialogues, really sort of trying to figure out, how do you know what you know? And how do I know what I know? And sort of at least being able to identify when in an argument there are different starting places, like what's our sort of agreed upon values or truths or whatever, and can we contain our discussion within them, and if not, at least acknowledge like we're starting with different pieces to work with to sort of, like we're all trying to make sense of the world, but if we're starting with different sets of truths that we start with that we largely have inherited from somewhere. I don't know. I just think it's easy to get a little haughty, for any of us to get haughty and say that like we know such and such, but mostly what we know because people we trust told us.
Yeah.
And so if we trust different people, then we just have to, I can't figure out how to say this much more eloquently. I have a very close friend who listens to this podcast sometimes, so I don't know if she's listening or not, but who is a conservative Catholic, and we have really interesting conversations about a lot of different religious and social issues and the way that our belief systems influence sort of where we come down. And it's taken us many years, and we still trip up on this all the time, but it's taken us many years to come to a point where we can at least identify like, oh yeah, I see how if you're starting with this set of beliefs, it's going to take you here, and you feel a religious obligation to do X. Whereas if I have this set of beliefs, it's going to take me here, and I have a religious obligation to do Y.
Mm-hmm.
And we can at least sort of respect the internal consistency of each other's worldviews. What do you think, Bobby? How does this text live for you?
I really love, both of the things that you just pulled out of the text, and so I want to affirm those. And the other thing that I'm thinking about is this, the overall point here that Jesus is saying is, what matters is what you put into the world. And the reason that your heart is important is because your heart is the source of the things you put into the world, right? So the way that you are formed and shaped produces effects in the world. And so you can measure yourself by what's going out there. So Jesus is not saying nothing external to you matters. What he's saying, I think, is what's external to you matters in so much as that's what shapes your heart, like shapes your attitudes, shapes your feelings and emotions, right? So you need to be careful about what authorities you listen to and what influence you take. Not because those things necessarily matter in and of themselves, but because they make you a certain kind of a person. And then that person then is what matters. And I don't think that the Pharisees actually would disagree with Jesus about that at all. That the reason that the Torah is important is because it shapes people to live in the world in certain kinds of ethical ways that reflect God's values. What I think they're really arguing about at the end of the day is, does washing your hands matter as just a physical act of washing your hands? But I don't know that even the Pharisees really would have thought yes. I think the Pharisees would have thought ritual, washing your hands, keeping kosher, these things matter because they're a certain way of keeping God in mind all the time. So the hand washing is not just like, yeah, you ought to wash your hands, but it's got a bigger picture about what kind of person am I? Like, how should I then live in the world? So I really want to think that Jesus and the Pharisees here have made a category mistake. They both really, at the end of the day, care about how your external practices shape you, because at the end of the day, what matters is like who you are in community, who you are in the world, what you put out there. And exactly how you get there is not really all that important. Jesus and the Pharisees have both kind of gotten focused on how do you get there here. So I think that's helpful for us too, to think like there are lots of ways of getting at like who are you in the world and producing things in the world that God values, like love of neighbor and love of God and support of people who are marginalized and these kinds of things. And the details of exactly how we get there maybe are less important than that the way our heart gets shaped and produces outcomes.
No, I really like that. And I really love the way that you underscored the role of ritual in sort of the formation of the person and sort of like our message to ourselves about who we are and what we're connected to and what we prioritize. I have different groups I've worked with in my synagogue at different points that work on what I use a somewhat Christian translation of it, gifts of the Spirit.
Yeah.
Things like, humility or patience, stuff like that. They're called midot in Hebrew. And part of what we do is like we read text and we study and we talk about it, but we take on practices. Like we say, what are some things that you're going to actually do every day to help you with patience? And like identify what are the points in your day where you always run out of patience? What are some, what is a mantra you can recite? Or what are things you can do to remind you that you're working on this? And it becomes your own personal ritual. But as you're saying, like it's a ritual that's built to help you shape what you're putting out there into the world.
Well, I really love that read. I will confess to you that I was not excited about talking about this text.
You weren't?
Like, really at all. No, can you believe it? Even though I texted to you before we talked that I didn't want to talk about it. But I will say that I now appreciate this text in a completely different way, having talked with you about it.
That's always the goal, right? To come into it one way and come out another way. Hopefully a more positive way. I guess not always a more positive way. But no, this was a really interesting section of text. A lot of fun.
Next week we're in Mark 8:27 through 9:8. And so we get Peter's confession, finally, that Jesus is the Messiah. And then Jesus starts, as soon as that happens, starts talking about how he's going to get crucified. And then we get the story of the Mount of Transfiguration. So lots of good stuff.
All right. Well, it was great fun talking with you.
Likewise.
And we'll see y'all next week.
See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of BibleWorm, wriggling our way through the scriptures. Come back next week when we discuss Mark 8:22 through 9:8, in which Peter comes this close to getting it right, but ends up missing by a mile. We'll see you then.